So now that I've split all of my parts out of that log, I want to show you how I go about getting them out of a board. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about selecting the boards, because that's going to play a huge role in how successful you are in this process. So let's talk about some of these terms I've been using. The tangential plane and the radial plane are really important. They're important when you're taking apart a log, busting it apart into parts to note those things, because the log is going to split differently, shave differently, and move differently depending on which of these planes you're talking about. It's really important when you're looking at getting a board, though, as well, because when you're getting a board, really we're trying to undo what the saw did to the board, which was to ignore the long fibers completely, and some of the clues as to how well it did in tracking along the fibers is going to be available to us. And the way it's available to us most visually is on the surface here. So this is a flat sawn board, and I always choose flat sawn, not quarter sawn boards. And what you can see is the growth rings along there, and you can see how they track pretty nicely. I believe it's in this area here very nicely. You can see one growth ring all the way down there. That means that saw tracked really beautifully right down the growth of this tree. That's wonderful as far as the growth goes, but that isn't the whole story. Before I move on from talking about that, I want to point out that at the bottom here, you see a little bit more cutting across the growth rings. That's really common. That's just because the tree comes down and flares out, so of course you're going to cut across a few more. I figure that part is just going to be used for shorter parts, because the parts that come out of it are going to have to be a little bit angled to follow what is the flow of those fibers that you can so readily see got cut across there. But jumping out of that talk into the radial plane, the problem is the radial plane isn't quite so apparent. And a lot of times I think people think they can look at the edge of the board and see what's going on in the radial plane, and you really can't. So real briefly, I want to cover what it is that happens here. When you're looking at and thinking about the tangential plane, it's easy to think of them as tubes. I mean, that's what a tree looks like, right? It's a big tube with a bunch of littler tubes inside of it. And that's really how a tree grows, and I think that's what inhabits most of our minds when we think about trees. It's just a simple tube. And then how you cut across that straight or at an angle is going to reveal itself on the surface. And that is what I was just talking about. That's kind of easy to see. The problem is there's a whole other story going on here. Not only do you have a tube, and a tube within a tube, like I was talking about, but those tubes themselves can be twisted. They can be made up of twisted fibers. So what happens as the tree is growing, it's actually following the wind and the sun and all sorts of things, and it can be twisted. This is why trees that grow in the middle of the woods are generally preferable to trees that grow at the edge of the woods or in a field, because those trees are more likely to have a twist to them. The problem is we can't always read that, depending on the species, just from this surface of the board. It's just not going to give us that information. So we have to find a way to get it. Another way to think about this, I think this might be a helpful view of this, is imagine this is a tree here, and basically, if you imagine the tree grew straight, you can see that here it's growing straight and that all the fibers are running straight up and down. And if a tree is twisted, it looks like this. Okay, so you can see how those wrap around in a rotary fashion as they go up. And that is what we have to figure out. So undoing the way the saw interacted with the tangential plane is pretty easy and obvious. The radial plane, not so much. So like I said, you might be tempted to look at the edge of the board here to try and say how the radial plane is running, but it really doesn't give you that information. All you're seeing is the edge of the growth rings, and really it's a curved object that's responding to a flat line being cut down it. It's probably tapered as well. These lines are going to be running all over the place because they're just the edge of the growth rings reacting to a saw. It really doesn't tell you that much about how the fibers are running through here. The best way that I've found to find how the fibers are running through is to split the board down the middle. The other way to do it is to saw the board and then take a draw knife to the center of the board so that you can find where the fiber line is with the draw knife. That's for species that don't split so well, sort of like walnut or with cherry if you were going to be doing the same process. But here with the ash splits pretty nicely, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by splitting this board in half, and we're going to see, even though this board was nicely sawn in relation to the tangential plane and to the growth rings, we'll see exactly how it relates to the radial plane. So now I'm going to split this board really just like it was a log. And what I'll do is I want to start in the middle of this board. Even though the growth rings seem a little off-center, the center of the pith is a little bit off, I'm going to start in the middle, because just like I was mentioning before, when you split things in equal halves, the split is more likely to run straight. That way, if it doesn't run straight, we know it's the result of the fiber line tending off to a direction, and not just the fact that I tried to split a smaller part off a larger part. So as I imagined, this board did not run perfectly straight down the middle. Now it was sawn, you could see from the way that the growth rings were running, it was sawn a little off angle from the way the tree grew. But that isn't enough to actually fully explain what happened here. What we are actually seeing, I believe, is the relationship between that twist a little bit. So you can see that this board here has a little bit of an angle to it and a little bit of an arc to it. That is definitely the hallmark sign of a little bit of a twist. It's not much, and this is actually a beautifully sawn piece, because when I look at it now, head on to that center split, what I said about the growth rings on the edge of the board no longer applies. Once we've split it, those growth rings give you a very accurate view of what's going on with the fiber line. So we've got now the fiber line in the radial plane as well as the tangential. So often what you'll find is that those lines will be a little bit angled. And if that's the case, then you need to follow those angles to get a straight grain piece of wood out of it. So here's a piece of wood that I split down the center, and I found that indeed the growth rings did not follow the surface of the board very nicely. So when you look at this one, you can see that they run at quite an extreme angle. And the nice thing is most of the parts we're going to be using for a chair like this, and just about any of my chairs, are tapered at both ends for joinery, and then they get smaller where, like, say, a leg meets the floor, or where a tenon is going to go into another part. So what I can do is I can just actually cut the corner off down here, and the corner off down here, and now the axis of my part is actually going to go from this point to this point down here, and when I do that, it's going to follow the fibers, and it's also going to give me the width that I need here in the center. So you see where I'm not actually cutting anything away, it's just going to help me reorient that to get those straight grain fibers. One of the key elements of getting straight grain wood out of a piece after you've split it is that now, when I go back to this board, it's important that I don't use the original sawn face as the reference edge. The new reference has to be the split edge. So when I'm going into this board and I'm going to be pulling some legs out of it, I want to make sure that I'm doing it in relation to that new split edge. So I think it's worth taking a moment and looking a little closer at that board I showed you a few minutes ago that had the angled growth rings in it once it was split. So you can see here from the face of it, where I've darkened in those growth rings, that sure enough, they cut across the surface of the face of it. It's obviously a sure sign that the saw did not follow the growth rings when it cut in that area. And then, as I showed you before, when we turned it here, you could see that the center of the axis of the part I was going to get was going to have to be at an angle. And that's not a problem. I just have to readjust it. And again, the center part's going to be plenty thick and the two tapered ends will be fine. But I thought it was worth showing you what happens now when I do follow the growth rings that are exposed on that split face. So when I turn it this way and I solder down those growth rings, you can see that now I've got a beautiful growth ring that runs the entire length of the piece. So this part now is really no different than if it had been split out of a log. It follows the fibers both in the radial and the tangential plane. It's going to give us everything we want as far as the strength and the workability.